You're watching Promethean Action's weekly class series for December 7th, 2024. Tonight's is the third of a series on Promethean Action's pamphlet, What President Trump Can Do with the American System 2.0, which you can find right at the top of our website, prometheanaction.com. I'll also put it in the chat later on tonight. And tonight's speaker will be Ben Deniston, who's a major author of that pamphlet. The subject is Lyndon LaRouche's concept of the transformative effect of infrastructure. So let me pass it to Ben Deniston.
Thanks, Tony. Glad to be on again. So like Tony mentioned, this is the third in our series of classes on our new economics pamphlet. And people haven't seen the earlier classes. We're taking the contents of the pamphlet kind of backwards. And the whole thesis of this report, again, if people haven't seen the first couple classes or seen this pamphlet, is we're looking at how Lyndon LaRouche's work provides a unique advancement on the American system of economics. And if people aren't familiar with the American system of economics, that is the unique economic perspective, policies of protectionism, internal improvements, national banking and national credit run by a sovereign nation having control over its banking, overall banking structure and monetary system. These are the policies that really built the country, policies that we've moved away from increasingly over the past 50 years, really since World War II, the end of World War II, but it really accelerated in the early 1970s. And you know, we argue that this shift away from these policies has been critical in leading to the economic problems we have now. And what we're promoting here, many of us have worked with, many of us at Promethean Action, Promethean PAC as well. We've worked with the American physical economist Lyndon LaRouche for many years. And we're big advocates of his work, his perspective. And as we present in this pamphlet, we believe his work provides the basis for taking what we have with the American system and advancing it even further and making it even more powerful in providing the ability to not just fix our country, not just get out of the current economic mess we're in, but actually return to a type of transformative, qualitative growth that we haven't seen, that the kind of change that is, like we discussed in some of the earlier classes, the kind of changes that define human beings as unique and different than animals and any form of animal life on this planet. The kinds of changes that created this nation and made us the most productive nation on the planet at a certain point, and getting back to those kinds of qualitative revolutionary leaps that underlie real economic growth. So that's what we're taking up, and that's what we're introducing, I think, rather uniquely into the discussion right now in the country. Very exciting, open, ripe environment right now with this new political coalition that Trump has created, that's congealed around President Trump. Just an incredible environment to take these ideas and organize around these ideas. So, we're having a lot of fun with it. There's going to be a lot of intense political battles along the way, but this is just such an exciting opportunity to, again, not only return to what has made America great, to use a phrase we're all familiar with, but to advance it and take it further and take our nation into new territories, create new leaps, new unique contributions to advancing our country for current population and future generations. So tonight, what we're going to look at is the question of infrastructure in that context. And we're going to look at specifically at the questions of energy, electricity and energy more generally, water, fresh water supplies, and transportation systems. And we're going to look at these things as I wrote in the pamphlet in this section, not as like necessarily commodities or goods themselves. There's some element of that, right? Electricity is a commodity. These are things that get purchased and used in the economy, sure. But these systems play a much more fundamental, important role than just another commodity. They really create the conditions, or as Mr. LaRouche used to discuss, the phase space or the physical economic space-time in which production and economic activity occurs. Right. So hopefully it'll become a little clearer as we go through this. These are systems, large scale. You're talking about national investments, large regional, statewide, regional, and national projects and investments that really create the conditions and transform the conditions in which, industry, manufacturing, agriculture, commerce in general can occur, right? And so we'll try and illustrate that a little bit with some historical examples, and then provide a kind of general perspective on where we think this stuff should go. So I'm going to share some slides I got here. Should I get the right thing shared there? And I'm going to open with a quote from Lyndon LaRouche on the subject of infrastructure from 2010, in a period when he was putting a kind of new emphasis, a new perspective, and trying to uplift and change people's conception of infrastructure. Now, I might be speculating a little bit. My sense at the time was that he was responding to kind of like an increased popularity in the term infrastructure. It would kind of become a talking point more generally. There started to become more open and more common discussion of the state of our infrastructure, and the need to make certain investments in fixing our infrastructure. But again, this is kind of my perspective on kind of what motivated Mr. LaRouche to make this kind of campaign he did at this time in 2010. But my sense was that he thought that it was really banalizing and it was not going at high enough level. It wasn't, the people didn't really understand the significance of what infrastructure really means if it's done right in an advancing economy. So this is from a video broadcast discussion he had at the time. He said, infrastructure enables mankind to increase the quality and quantitative feature of productivity of labor as a qualitative step upward. Infrastructure as such, when it's applied in this way to mankind, introduces a qualitative leap upward in the possibility of productive economy. That is, agriculture and industry depend for their improvements based largely on the factor of basic economic infrastructure as I've just defined it. Right, so he had a lot more to say around this time period. There's a lot of really rich writings and talks he did on this subject of infrastructure at that time. But again, he's trying to introduce a higher, deeper conception of what the significance of infrastructure really means. And I'm going to start to try and illustrate that on the question of energy. And I find this just a useful reference point to begin our discussion, because on the question of energy, we've all been exposed to this battle over the green energy policy. The attempt to have a top-down imposition of solar power, wind power, so-called green, supposedly renewable sources of energy, largely pushed on the basis of this CO2 issue. The claim that CO2 in the atmosphere is a pollutant, this claim that we're causing catastrophic climate change, and the entire planet's going to be destroyed by extreme weather in the next 10 years and all this crazy stuff. And we can get into some of that if we want in the Q&A. But we're all familiar with this fight over green energy. And Trump has been an incredibly important force in opposing that stuff, and we saw very clearly in his first term, and we see indications he's certainly going to continue that, so that's excellent. But I think this gives us a useful perspective on, so when we say infrastructure, when I'm talking about infrastructure, when Mr. LaRouche is talking about infrastructure, we're kind of assuming there's a shared conception of progress and infrastructure moving forward, and the new frontier areas of infrastructure, right? So to illustrate what that is, this might be basic for some of our audience, especially people familiar with Mr. LaRouche's work, but just to kind of get us all on the same page, I think this case of energy is very useful to illustrate actual progress, actual forward motion versus things that aren't that, things that are entropic or degenerate or economic failures like the green program. So a very, very useful perspective on this is looking at the different sources of energy available to mankind in terms of either their energy densities of the fuel sources or the energy flux densities of the application of those energies. So here is a table that's from our pamphlet. I think a just useful perspective on giving people a sense of this, where we're looking at different sources of energy, right? Wood, coal, diesel, gasoline, natural gas, and then a typical form of nuclear fuel, more specifically nuclear fusion fuel, right? This is the nuclear power plants that we have currently in operation, is nuclear fission power, powered by uranium typically. And then a measurement of fusion, what one option for a future nuclear fusion fuel, right? And each one of these represents a step upward in the energy density, meaning the amount of energy you get for the same unit amount of weight of the energy. Or another way to look at it, an equivalent way, is just a comparison that I worked up a little while ago we used in this report, just to give people a sense. If you were to start with like a 16-gallon gas tank, right? It's kind of typical for maybe a smaller car, right? A 16-gallon gas tank, that's a volume of gas, right? Certain weight amount of gasoline, right? In this case, if we just say diesel, that's got a certain amount of energy in it, right? So to get that same amount of energy, you can look at how much of these different fuel sources, how much of these different fuels you'd need, right? For coal, you'd need 200 pounds of coal, right? About twice the weight in terms of would be equivalent to about twice the weight of the 16-gallon gas tank, right? So you need like 2 gas tanks essentially worth of coal. For wood, you'd need 300 pounds, right? Good 50% up above even the coal. So you need significantly more weight, more volume, more amount of fuel just to provide the same amount of energy, right? Going the other way, natural gas, you'd need 90 pounds. Maybe a little funny thing to compare in terms of the gas tank there. But then the big leap comes, so this is like your progression of chemical fuels going from wood to coal to gasoline to natural gas. And then you see an amazing leap when you go to nuclear fuels, right? With the type of fuel that powers, again, our nuclear plants today, you get the same amount of energy from a just basic paper clips worth, the equivalent weight of a paper clip, right? Small little paper clip, if I had one here, right? Yeah, actually, paper clips worth of nuclear fission fuel gives you the same amount of energy as an entire gas tank, a 16-gallon gas tank of diesel fuel. An amazing leap upward. And with fusion, it's even more significant. A single grain of rice worth, so a grain of rice being even significantly, a good chunk smaller and lighter than a paper clip, would give you the same amount of fuel, right? One grain of rice worth of fusion fuel gets the same amount of energy provided as an entire 16-gallon gas tank. So anyway, if people aren't familiar with that, it's fun to kind of be introduced to this comparison of the different energy densities, the amount of energy you get out of the same weight of different sources of fuel. And this has been the progress and development of civilizations has moved along this scale, where you move to energy sources with greater energy density, meaning that for the same weight of resource you're providing, you're getting more and more energy available to be used by your society to do more things and so on. So this is kind of like a useful, general framework for progress and development in the U.S. economy, but also, much broader historically in terms of how civilizations developed, moved to more advanced states, higher conditions of life, and so on, has been through this, shifting to more advanced forms of energy in these terms, right? And then you have this whole green revolution that comes in, revolution in quotes, right? This big push on the green stuff, which is a little bit funnier to compare because people, the selling point for a lot of people is that you're not going out and mining coal or pumping oil or mining uranium, right? The energy is free, it's there, it's accessible, just in the natural environment. You don't have to go mine the fuel source, right? And that's posited as the why these green energies are so great. But the reality is the physical economic reality is that these are actually moving in exactly the opposite direction, because the energy density, or to be a little more specific, the energy flux density, the availability of energy over time per area, for sunlight or for wind, is so vastly small that it requires just huge amounts of wind turbines, huge amounts of solar panels to access any significant amount of electricity through these systems, right? And this is stuff we've covered, and we have some more on it in the pamphlet and stuff we've covered a lot, but I wanted to kind of start with this as a comparison of, people can argue, and it has been argued, and the Biden administration pushed this heavily. We want to invest in infrastructure. We want to create jobs building infrastructure. We want to improve our infrastructure. And the way we're going to do it is the Green New Deal, mass construction of wind and solar and so on as the basis for powering the economy, shifting away from fossil fuels and all that. That's been pushed as an infrastructure program, right? So that's been called infrastructure, right? But as we're about to see, it's not a good infrastructure program. It's not beneficial. It's not moving in the right direction. Again, I think probably many of us know this, but we're just using this as an example to illustrate what we mean by positive infrastructure programs. So this is a chart here showing a way to kind of try and get a bit of an apples to apples comparison with wind and solar compared to other sources of energy. This doesn't necessarily tell us the whole picture, but it gives us at least a beginning way to compare. What we're looking at here is the total material input required. So we're looking at aluminum requirements, copper, steel, cement, concrete, glass, that's needed to build the systems that provide the electricity in this case, right? So for coal, for natural gas, for nuclear power, for wind, and for solar, right? And then this allows, if we put it in these terms, it allows us to compare what's the total amount of material needed to provide over the life cycle of the system that provides the electricity. What's the material requirement to provide the same amount of electricity, right? So here we're talking about 1,000 gigawatt hours of electricity, just kind of the reference point in the report that I looked at that had this study, a government report. So that's just unfortunately off the top of my head, I don't have a reference for how but that's a significant amount of power, right? Significant amount of electricity. How much that'll power a given state for a certain amount of time, I'm not sure off the top of my head. We could look that up. But it's just compare a certain amount of electricity. But then you can see that the physical material inputs required to provide that electricity by building the power plants or building the windmills or building the solar panels is vastly, vastly different. It requires way more material inputs to provide the same amount of electricity when you're dealing with wind and solar, right? You're talking about like 10 to 15 times higher, right? We're not talking about small, little differences here. As you can see, it's not like, wind and solar takes a little bit more. It's an order of magnitude plus more, right? 10 to 15 times more. Right. So that's the physical, what we're looking at is a measure of a major component of the physical costs of providing the energy, right? And here, to be fair, we're not including, the fuel source, right? So, that's another element to compare, and it'd be fun to try and get all that together into one comparison, which is, maybe something we could do to take this into even further resolution. But hopefully just to get a sense that why it is, and this is again stuff we've covered before, I don't have the charts here, but places that have tried to mass implement wind and solar, very rapidly have among the highest costs of electricity, because these systems are not efficient. They're very costly, because you have to build so many windmills, so many solar panels, right? Because the energy density is the energy flux density, the concentration of sunlight hitting the surface of the earth, right? The intensity of wind passing through the atmosphere. It's not a concentrated source of energy. It's very diffuse. It's very dispersed. So you have to build, again, significant numbers of windmills, significant numbers of solar panels to cover large territories, right? Just to capture enough electricity to be meaningful. So that comes with a physical cost. So it's why you see, places like California, where they've gone very heavily into this stuff, their electricity rates have risen way higher than the rest of the country on average. Or countries in Europe like Germany, like Denmark, that have gone heavily into this supposedly renewable green energy source, have seen dramatic increases in electricity as a consequence of that, even before all the natural gas cheap natural gas situation with Russia and Ukraine, before even that came onto the scene, they were already seeing the effects of this, right? So, you know, what does that look like in the context of applying these programs, these different sources of electricity throughout the economy as an infrastructure program, right? And this, I think, will make the most sense if people have seen the previous couple classes and they have a baseline in terms of the physical economics that we discussed. But I think this is a very useful way to look at the failure of the green program as an energy program, as an infrastructure program, versus what a successful energy and infrastructure program looks like. So this is a chart with the actual data up until about 2020, and then a forecast from 2020 onward. And this is looking at the total electricity generated by the U.S. economy. That's our blue line with the dots, the dotted line there. Each dot is one of the years, and that's the total amount of electricity generated, right? And then the area charts in the yellow and blue and red, those are the measured here, the tons of material required to build the windmills and the solar panels and the other and whatever other kinds of power plants in order to provide that energy. And this is looking at what that would look like in the context of Biden's, what became the infrastructure program, which was just a cover for what they had been calling the Green New Deal, right? So this is taking the proposed policy of the Biden administration to get down to zero CO2 levels by 2035, by phasing out coal, phasing out natural gas. I don't remember what they did with nuclear, what their view on that was. And then replacing those sources of energy with wind and solar, right? And as we can see clearly here, the physical costs, right? The material input required, the physical costs to provide the same amount of electricity, right, go up and up and up year over year, right? To the point where it's, over 3 to 4 times, almost 4 times as much, right? In terms of the physical inputs required to build and sustain and maintain the systems that provide you the electricity. So this is what a theoretical Green New Deal infrastructure transition program looks like, right? And I hope people see this and they say that doesn't look good, right? You're getting the same thing year over year, right? In terms of a steady amount of electricity being generated, right? And year over year, the physical cost to provide that same amount of electricity goes up and up and up and up, right? Does that sound like a good program? Does that sound like progress? Does that sound like it's going to help the economy, right? So this is the negative example of, what this is what a bad infrastructure program is, right? So this is kind of, to give a counterpoint to what we want to do, which is have actual transformative growth, negentropic growth, as we defined it and discussed it in the pamphlet, real human creative progress and human creative development. And this is a contrary chart, which we made here, which shows the opposite. Instead of going to a lower energy flux density source of power, of energy with wind and solar, we go the opposite direction. We continue in this historical process of moving to sources of energy that are defined by higher levels of energy density, right? And this forecast here, this projection here would be if we phase out all wind and solar, we keep fossil fuels, I think at the time when I did this, I think we keep them pretty much consistent. And then we increase the emphasis on nuclear power, first nuclear fission and then beginning to introduce nuclear fusion, right? And here we see the exact opposite of what we saw before. Before we saw electricity provided stays the same. Costs go up, right? Not good. This is the opposite. This is real transformative progress, real negentropic growth. Physical costs, in this case, remain pretty steady from 2020 onward, right? Even go down a little bit, right? In terms of, again, the requirements to build, sustain, maintain the power plants and all that, right? The physical input cost for that stays steady, but we get a dramatically increasing amount of electricity generated as a result of that, right? That sounds good to me, right? That's more characteristic of the type of real economic, again, negentropic growth, as we defined it in the pamphlet, that characterizes human progress, that characterizes what makes human beings different than the animals, right? And it's a type of progress. And the reason why I'm kind of taking some time to really try and illustrate this is that this is the type of progress that we've really haven't seen in my lifetime, right? In the last 50 years as a country, we've had, incremental progress here and there, and we've, had some improvements. We've had a lot of declines also. Many areas of the economy are worse or not getting better. But even the places we've had progress and growth, we've really failed to have the kinds of qualitative, transformative progress that built our country, that characterizes, what makes mankind unique. So, we have a unique perspective, a unique role to try and educate people and get people to understand that this is the kind of large-scale transformative growth that we need to return to as a country, right? So I find this is just a very useful pedagogy, very useful example, taking this kind of narrow slice, looking at energy. Again, what we're seeing here with this relatively constant material inputs to build your power plants, to maintain your power plants, to sustain your power plants, and yet we're getting higher and higher and higher output in terms of electricity generated, right? So if we want to do what the MAGA movement's been talking about, what Trump's been talking about in terms of reshoring, bringing manufacturing back, bringing production back, we're going to need a lot more energy, right? We're going to need a lot more energy, a lot more electricity if we're going to do that. So we're going to need to be able to provide a lot more energy, a lot more electricity cheaply and abundantly to support that initiative. But it goes beyond even that. So that's what we're going to get into a little bit here. I think I'm going to skip those for the moment and focus on this idea of well, let's go back to this. So this is, again, people might have seen this a bunch already from me if they've seen my presentations before. If you're new, this is a chart that I like a lot. This is looking at another perspective on the progress and growth of the U.S. economy viewed through this lens of total energy consumption and energy use. And what we have here is from the founding of the country, 1776 up to, I believe this was up to 2020 is when I ran these numbers on this study. And what we're looking at is the total energy consumption across the entire economy. That's not just like your personal consumption as for like your household use, but also accounting for agricultural activity, industrial activity, manufacturing, and so on, right? We're totaling up all energy use across the economy. And then we're dividing it by the total number of people. So we're accounting for population growth, right? So it's a per capita, per person figure. And what we see very clearly is there's periods where we had significant growth in the amount of energy consumption per person in the economy. And then the last 70 years, you can see it's definitely flatlined and begun to decline down. And it's a little more developed here because we also have it broken down into different sources of energy, right? Wood and biomass versus coal versus oil versus natural gas versus nuclear. So that kind of gives us also a very interesting perspective, which kind of could be a whole nother discussion itself, looking at the different contributions to the total energy supply for the country from these different sources, right? But the point here is that we've seen a major growth in the energy use per person in the economy up until about 50 years ago, the late 70s, or the early 70s, we began to see this flat line stagnate and then begin to decline. But this type of increased, this is an expression of the type of growth we were just looking at. And, I would love to, I've kind of got some studies sketched out where I would like to illustrate this with actual historical data in more detail. So some of this, is in a little bit in general terms here. But this increase of energy consumption and energy use per person, has not come from just a linearly growing percentage of the economy in terms of material requirements and productive operatives going into providing the energy and electricity. We've seen the type of qualitative effect we were just looking at, where we're able to get higher and higher amounts of energy available, electricity available, with the same compared to the same amount of material inputs required to produce them and labor force employed in electricity and energy production, right? So this historical picture here of the growth of energy consumption per capita throughout the history of the economy is an expression, a reflection, and a result of that kind of negentropic growth, where we're able to continually provide more energy, more electricity per person, per operative producing it. And that type of growth, that type of negentropic progress has revolutionary transformations. And we looked at this a little bit, and the next chart is my personal perspective on what a growth program from today forward could and should look like. With a heavy emphasis on growing nuclear energy as the primary source of increased electricity supply for the country. I know the Trump administration has a lot of emphasis on fossil fuels, which I think is also great. So, I'm not, what we might end up doing might look a little bit different than this, which I think is fine. But in terms of the total increase, that certainly needs to happen one way or another. A economic recovery, a transformation in the economy, progress is absolutely going to require a major increase in the energy available, electricity available. And when we put it in these physical terms, what we were looking at earlier, the end result of that, the implication, the kind of how that gets manifested as a result of this type of negentropic growth is a higher abundance of energy, a higher abundance of electricity at a lower cost, right? And that has amazing, amazing transformative effects for the economy, for resources. And we're going to look at here some examples, some specific cases of transforming the resources available to society, that we can use for our economy. So I'm going to just jump to a couple examples. These are things, again, we have in our pamphlet, we have in our report. But if you take something like we talked about this a little bit last week, you take the case of iron ore production, right? Iron by weight is the most used element in an economy by mankind. Very significant. Obviously it's the main component in steel, right? And steel is a, just hugely important component of any economy, right? And so our economies around the world, we're dependent on the ability to acquire iron ores, refine them, use them to produce steel to power the economy, right? But that as a resource available to us is not a fixed, finite thing. Sure, there's certainly a finite amount of iron on the planet Earth and in the planet Earth. It's probably an astronomical figure. But what's available to us as a resource, as iron, is not a fixed value. It's a relative value, which is determined by our level of technology. And very importantly, what we're focusing on here in today's class, as a function of the energy availability and the cost of energy, to take it in its final expression, the cost of energy available to people engaged in manufacturing and production in the development of natural resources, right? So if you have a dramatic lowering of the cost of electricity, right, and that, again, that's a final effect of the type of negentropic growth we were just looking at, that allows you to actually open up new areas as sources of natural, as available as natural resources that weren't available as natural resources before. So to read just some short quotes that we have in the pamphlet that discusses this, large regions of Oregon and Washington in the Pacific Northwest contain massive deposits of aluminum ores called laterite soils, with concentrations generally 1/5 to 1/2 of what is currently used for aluminum ores, which are bauxite, right? So just to give a specific example to help illustrate kind of the more general point we've been talking about, you have huge areas in the Pacific Northwest in Washington and Oregon where you have soils, laterite soils, which have aluminum in them, right? Aluminum is another resource, obviously very important to the economy, right? Just to take an example. But the concentration, the amount of aluminum in these laterite soils is significantly less than what is currently used as the sources of aluminum with bauxite, aluminum ores, in terms of bauxite. So about 1/5 to 1/2 in terms of the amount of aluminum, per unit weight of the ore. So with current technologies, these massive deposits are basically worthless, right? The concentrations are low, so the energy required to concentrate, to separate out the aluminum and concentrate the aluminum to use as a raw material isn't worth it. But with higher energy flux density technologies, And these will become accessible and profitable deposits, right? And this is something we discuss, kind of skipped over a little bit here, but looking at, you know, the advancement of new technologies used for processing raw materials, for concentrating, for processing ores and concentrating raw materials. You know, as those become more advanced and really supported by what we were discussing, a higher availability of electricity, of energy in the economy at, again, a lower cost. Now all of a sudden you begin to have the potential for these transformative effects, right? Where entire areas which are currently just dirt, just not worth mining, not worth processing, just not worth anything to us, worthless, right? If we move into a higher energy flux density economy, where we're able to produce more electricity, produce more energy at the same or lower physical cost to us, right? Meaning we have more energy and electricity available to us at cheaper prices. All of a sudden, you have the ability to apply it in greater amounts at the same cost to you. And all of a sudden, things that were not economical before become economical, right? So it just really, this whole idea of a fixed set of natural resources available to mankind is really a terrible fiction that unfortunately a lot of people has been ingrained in much of the population in recent decades. And really the way we should be talking about it is, yeah, at any level of technology, at any level of energy flux density of the economy, there is a fixed limit to the economically accessible resources, but it's a function of your technological level. It's a function of your energy flux density of your economy as a whole, right? So again, going back to the whole point here we're talking about in terms of transformative effects, right? Infrastructure in the form of energy and electricity supporting the entire economy, right? It's not just another commodity to be bought and sold and traded, right? Your ability to provide your energy, provide your electricity at a more advanced mode through this type of negentropic growth literally changes our complete relation to the natural resources available to us as a species, right? It's an amazing transformative effect that's created through actual revolutionary infrastructure advancements like we're talking about here. So to give just a couple more examples, we also discussed in the pamphlet, you know, we just looked at aluminum. You know, you could even take iron, right? I mentioned iron is obviously a very significant resource for the economy. So in the report, we say the same is true for iron ores for steel production. Currently, current iron ores are about 25% iron, while the average soil is about 5% iron. So with appropriate technological advancements, that soil, just basic average everyday soil, could become a resource for iron ore. Again, iron being the most used by weight element in the entire periodic table, providing the basis, the main component of steel, which is, you know, the entire economy is built on steel, right? So being able to have your average dirt, your average dirt on the planet become a resource for iron is not exactly insignificant. But you know, that would be the product. So you're talking about here a five-fold decrease in the iron concentration between current ores that are often used as the source of mining iron to average dirt. So if you had to speak in general terms, if you had a 5-fold increase in the amount of energy provided, energy and electricity available to the manufacturing process at the same cost, right? Now all of a sudden you open this up potentially as a resource, in general terms. And just highlight one other example, and then we can get into some discussion. You take the issue of water, right? Now water itself, is also part of infrastructure. But just to look at the interrelation here, right? With a higher, again, a negentropic growth in the energy sector component of the infrastructure for our country, we can begin to open up new ways of dealing with the just crazy bottleneck that we have with water availability in the west and the southwest of this country. And I'm specifically talking about through large-scale desalination, which is fairly energy intensive. It takes a lot of energy to take ocean water. The most efficient systems now are reverse osmosis, where they use a lot of pressure to push the seawater through these membranes to separate out the salt and get fresh water out of ocean water. And that technology exists. It's done in the United States. It's done all over the world. But it's fairly energy intensive. It's fairly expensive to do. Actually, not even that expensive. It's really come down a lot, but it's still relatively expensive in terms of other sources of water. And it takes a lot of energy. So it's another case where with, a significant increase in the energy availability produced in the economy at the same cost, right? Now you can begin to completely transform our ability to access the water supplies that we need, right? And just some figures on the water crisis. I did a little bit of refresher on this for the pamphlet, but if you just look at the past 25 years, on average, 43% of our territory, our national territory, has been categorized as abnormally dry, and that's, I guess, one category away from drought, and they have different levels of drought. But almost half the territory of our entire country, and where exactly that is moves around. It's not always in the same spots, although obviously some of the same spots, it's much more of a chronic issue. But on average of the last 25 years, 43% of our national territory has been considered abnormally dry. 26%, so a quarter of our territory as a nation has been in some level of drought consistently over the last 25 years, right? So, basically we're at 25% of the country is perpetually in some form of drought, right? So water is a major limiting issue for existing activity, let alone growth and development. Again, largely talking about the West and the Southwest, right? And just by the figures I've seen and the numbers I've run on it, even this is in a situation where we're pumping a lot of the water supplies in these regions. We're pumping water out of the ground at rates faster than it's being replenished. And we're almost, according to the numbers I've seen, we're almost pulling water out of the ground, again, at a rate faster than it's being replenished throughout the entire Southwest, and in a volume equivalent, or in a rate equivalent to almost an additional Colorado River, which the Colorado River supplies huge territory in the south, in the west and the Southwest. So we're basically taking almost an entire additional Colorado River's worth of water, just pumping it out of the ground, depleting these aquifers, So it's, it's not a sustainable situation. So the water situation is definitely a big crisis. And, there's a number of things a number of aspects to addressing this. But one of which certainly can be massive, large-scale desalination systems along the coastal regions. We've got some specific, kind of broad but specific proposals written up in the pamphlet. And we can, maybe for the sake of time, not go into the details here, but you could begin to provide, significant, make a significant impact with, if you start building large numbers of desalination systems along the coastal regions. But again, that's something in the current economic mode, in the current we could say level of energy flux density of the U.S. economy. That's not necessarily, a viable economic option, right? But with the type of program we were talking about at the beginning, a new infrastructure platform in terms of energy and electricity growth with higher levels of production, meaning you can have significantly higher amounts of electricity and energy available at lower costs, you begin to open up these things, right? So again, a transformation in the resources, available, right? And if you wanted to get more aggressive with it in terms of the desalination, you could be building pumping systems and piping systems to bring this water further inland. There's a lot that could be done. So this is another example of, the resources available in terms of water resources, right, can be fundamentally transformed with this type of infrastructure platform, this type of infrastructure growth, right? The entirety of the oceans, right? The oceans are, people probably have some sense, the oceans are just mind-numbingly vast and large, incredible, right? There's no way you could possibly have a significant impact on drawing down the entirety of the ocean level. So you have essentially, for all intents and purposes, an unlimited supply of water available, fresh water available in the oceans. If you just get to a high enough energy flux density mode where desalination becomes cheap enough to become a large scale operation, right? And just for this, and that water is ultimately going to return back to the oceans again anyway. So it's not like you're just using it up. It's all the cycle. And there's a lot more that could be done on the water side in terms of river diversion systems and canals. This is a diagram of the NWAPA program, the North American Water and Power Alliance, which is another grand design, amazing program that was never implemented, but it was designed out in detail to utilize some of the just abundant excess fresh water runoff that's just flowing directly into the ocean from Alaska through British Columbia down into the Washington, the whole Pacific Northwest region, and redirect a fraction of that down throughout the Southwest, connecting to the Colorado River, connecting to other rivers. And you could potentially bring, the original NWAPA design was looking at bringing 7 or 8 additional Colorado rivers worth of water down throughout the Southwest. So an amazing project. So again, this would be a type of infrastructure investment that would completely transform. This would be a way, this together with the desalination, like we're talking about, you would be completely eliminating drought throughout any regions that have been affected with it, and creating the basis for vast additional economic growth and development. So I think I've gone through a lot. I probably want to stop here, and we can shift over to questions. But I hope these illustrations hopefully gave people a sense of what we are talking about at Promethean Action what Lyndon LaRouche was talking about when we say infrastructure, right? It's not just, I'm living here in Michigan. We got a lot of roads that need to be rebuilt. We got a lot of stuff, there's a lot of bridges that need to be rebuilt throughout the country, right? There's a lot of stuff that needs fixing in the country in terms of our infrastructure, right? But that alone is not going to create the kind of transformative, qualitative growth and development that we need to return to. Again, like I said in the beginning, the kind of growth, transformative change, negentropic change that made America great, that originally, that distinguishes mankind from any other form of life on this planet, right? We need to have that conception driving what we're doing. We need to think big. We need to think transformative, right? And infrastructure is a incredibly important, critical part of that. So we should be thinking about not just fixing our roads and our bridges and our schools, although we need to do all of that, right? But we should be thinking about how can we fundamentally transform our relationship with the natural resources available to us on the planet in a way that vastly increases what's available to us to utilize for economic growth and development, right? Those are the kinds of qualitative transformations that real growth, real value, real economic progress comes from. So I think that's hopefully some fun stuff to discuss, and we can have some fun with that.
Right.